The evidence supports that jettison of debris from those fountains went up into space and God opened the windows. That's what the Bible says. A very reliable source.
The same day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened.
Welcome to this episode of Hydroplate Theory University with hydroplate theory experts Kevin Lee and Bill Wells.
Thank you for joining us today on the first podcast of hptuniversity.com and its associated YouTube channel, Hydroplate Theory. The animated depiction you just saw is not part of a science fiction trailer. It reflects the events and subsequent consequences of a global flood that occurred about 5,000 years ago. Ancient legends from many people groups all over the world speak of a cataclysmic flood that caused the death of all people except for those that were rescued by a boat. Many scholars think that those are all legends associated with the local flood. But what if they're wrong? What if the Bible accurately records a global historical event and that the Bible is the actual source? This event is the actual source of these legends. In Genesis 6:13, the Bible records God telling a man named Noah to build a boat to save his family in a warning that the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth.
The pre-flood earth was destroyed because of the universal wickedness of man. But God in his mercy spared Noah and his family, it's 8 people, on an ark. The earth we stand on now in many ways is still experiencing the aftermath of that global cataclysm with earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, shifting magnetic poles, falling land masses, and ongoing changes beneath our feet. These aren't rare anomalies. They're persistent indicators that powerful processes continue at work inside our planet. Could it be that the Bible is a reliable historical record of the ancient past?
For thousands of years, people have wondered and asked the question, how could there have been a global flood? Where did the water come from? Where did the water go? This HPT University podcast and website is dedicated to trying to answer those questions and many more. The answers to the questions are based on this book, the 9th edition of Dr. Walt Brown's Hydroplate Theory, which is titled, In the Beginning, Compelling Evidence for Creation and the Flood. The term hydroplate theory will be defined by Walt later in this podcast. The electronic flip book of the 9th edition is available at creationscience.com. It has strong search features, and you can read for yourself. In the future podcasts, we'll be covering chapters of the book, and you'll find it very useful to get to the website and to use the flipbook, and also to be able to buy the book if you want to at Amazon.com.
Contained in its pages are hundreds of references from many peer-reviewed papers written by non-Christian scientists who admit that many of their scientific discoveries are at odds with the evolutionary no global cataclysmic flood and billions of years narrative.
But as you'll see, though these scientists are puzzled with these findings, hydroplate theory advocates are not, because many of these discoveries were predicted by Walt Brown. And hydroplate theory advocates have even coined the phrase that all scientists work for Walt Brown. By way of introduction, I'm Kevin Lee, and joining me is Bill Wells, my co-host. This website, hptuniversity.com, and its associated YouTube channel have been created so that together we can help you read about the mountain of evidence in favor of a global catastrophic flood and allow you to make an informed decision for yourself. We are told that COVID did not come from gain-of-function research, and all thoughts to the contrary were censored and canceled. We now know they lied, and many suffered and died because the truth was kept from the people. Nearly every person on the planet is told by the same media and all forms of education what to think about origins and the past history of Earth. We are trained to believe that everything we see came about by time and chance over billions of years. Is it possible that the powers are also deceiving us about life's origins and Earth's history? Our plan through these podcasts is to uncensor and teach compelling evidence in order to let you think for yourself as you determine what theory is consistent with the facts based on the overwhelming scientific data.
Our bios are located on our website. In the next podcast, we'll provide information about why we've embarked on this mission. But right now, we would like to introduce you to Dr. Brown himself as he narrates an animation of some of the details of the hydroplate theory.
We can see on our planet many very strange features that can now be linked together and systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an unimaginable amount of explosive energy. This explanation shows how major mountains formed very quickly. It explains our coal, oil, and methane deposits, rapid continental drift, why we find on the ocean floor huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and rivers. The mountains were smaller than today, perhaps 5,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, about half the water that is now in our oceans was originally contained in interconnected subterranean chambers. This water formed a thin spherical shell at least a mile thick, perhaps 60 miles below the surface of the pre-flood Earth. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 2 miles a second. This crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 3 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 60 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of this rupture. All along the globe-encircling crack, fountains of water jetted supersonically into and far above the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day, and it describes these events about 5,000 years ago that we can now tie together scientifically in cause and effect order. Some of the water, jetting high above the stratosphere, froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the Earth. These sediments trapped and quickly buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Vegetation, uprooted by the floodwaters, accumulated in certain regions where it was buried and compressed, rapidly becoming our coal, oil, and methane deposits by processes we can duplicate in the laboratory today. Eventually, the rupture became so wide that the newly exposed compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like a seam of a baseball. continental plates, the hydroplates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of well over 60 miles an hour, they ran into resistances and, like a crashing continental-sized train, compressed, crushed, and buckled. As the continents crushed and thickened, they rose out of the floodwaters. The portions of the hydroplates that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled up formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. This also explains why today's continents do not have a jigsaw fit against each other, as so many textbooks mistakenly claim. Instead, the continents would fit much better against the sides of the mid-Atlantic ridge from where the continental drift began. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters eventually drained. This movement and the resulting compression and buckling was so cataclysmic that it occurred within a single day. Immediately after the flood, sea level was considerably lower than it is today, so land bridges connected every continent. This allowed people and animals to spread and repopulate the post-flood Earth. As the thickened continents slowly sank into the Earth's mantle, the new and very deep ocean floors had to rise in compensation for the downward flow of mass. Therefore, sea level slowly rose for a few centuries after the flood and eventually reached today's level. As sea levels rose, river channels were drowned, channels that had been cut down to the lowered sea level by the heavy drainage after the flood. This explains the famous submarine canyons that are extensions of our rivers such as the Amazon, the Congo, the Indus, the Hudson, and the Ganges. Because some submarine canyons are almost 3 miles below today's sea level, we can conclude that sea level and some seafloors were about 3 miles lower than today. The rising sea eventually flooded the natural bridges and produced the look of the continents as we see them today, separated by water. As the floodwaters drained off the continents, every continental basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes. Because of local conditions, some of these lakes simply dried up. Others continued to collect water from rainfall and drainage from higher elevations. Sometimes a large lake spilled over its rim at the lowest point, eroding a notch. If the rim wall was composed of sediments that were still soft, the escaping water quickly enlarged and deepened the notch. As the volume and speed of the rushing water increased, so did its eroding power, until the entire lake surged through a deep slit, forming a canyon. The largest canyon formed by this process is the Grand Canyon in Arizona. North and east of the Grand Canyon was a huge lake that I identified in 1987 and named Grand Lake. Grand Lake held twice the volume of water that is in Lake Michigan. Grand Lake spilled over its rim and carved this spectacular funnel 20 miles south of Page, Arizona, catastrophically forming the Grand Canyon within a few weeks and leaving a living testament to this terrible global flood, which can be studied in person today.
This animation you just saw was provided by Mike Snavely of Mission Imperative Ministry, who made the first printing of the 9th edition possible and is highlighted on the last page of the book. And there's a QR code that's on your screen that will direct you to his website. Many details were left out of this animation that will be talked about in future podcasts.
Now we want to introduce you to the man Walt Brown, who passed away September of 2025. Kevin and I each independently became aware of Dr. Brown's theory about 30 years ago as we read the 5th edition of his book in the early 90s. We also spent many dozens of hours on the phone asking questions of Walt, thus developing a strong relationship, including visiting him at his home along with some of his family on more than one occasion Based on our combined 60 years of personal experience, we want to attest to his genius, humility, and integrity that surpasses that of any of our other acquaintances.
But you don't have to take our word for it. We're going to soon be letting you know about Dr. Brown's military career, and it was stellar. And what we're about to talk about is also the rest of his life, some of which Bill and I have experienced with him ourselves, his integrity, his humility. But another book was written called Christian Men of Science, 11 Men Who Changed the World. Some of the information that we're about to tell you comes out of this book because Walt Brown is featured. The military considered Dr. Brown a genius, and they used him to teach the fighting men and women of our military at universities, etc., as we will soon be getting into as we go through his life.
Walt was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and in 1955 he left home to attend U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He graduated with the class of 1959. From there, he went to the Army's Airborne School in Fort Benning, Georgia. Coincidentally, that's a school that I also attended, but about 20 years after Walt did. Following Fort Benning, Walt went to the Army Ranger School, and then he decided that he wanted to go into the Ordnance Corps of the Army, which deals with the Army, all of the Army's equipment. So the Army sent Walt to the New Mexico State University to get a master's in mechanical engineering. And since he did so well at his mechanical engineering courses and enjoyed it, he also found that he had time to take courses in physics and math. From there, he was sent to the White Sands Missile Test Range, which is not too far from the University of New Mexico. At the White Sands Missile Test Range, currently they were, at the time, they were testing the 3 different missile systems, which Walt was put in charge of testing. And I'm going to screen share a picture of one of them. And it's the Little John missile, which was an artillery piece, artillery missile, a range of about 10 miles. It was about 14 feet long, 12 and a half feet in diameter, and would carry about a 1,500-pound warhead. And when Walt got there, they'd been testing this missile for about 2 years. And the reason they were testing it so long is because about 1/10 of about 10% of each of these missiles would fall short of their target, which not only would it miss the target, but also provides a very hazardous situation for our own troops, because artillery typically flies in over the heads of our own troops. And if the missile falls short, it endangers our troops. So Walt was brought in to try to figure out why this missile, about 10%, would be falling short. After watching some movies taken of the launches, Walt determined that this part here, circled in red, was not detaching like it should. It's called the shoe. It attaches the missile to the launch rail, keeps it going straight. But as soon as the missile departs the rail, the shoe needs to depart. And Walt figured out that shoe, in about 10% of the cases, was not departing the missile as it should, with the added weight and drag causing the missile to fall short. So he figured out a way to keep that shoe releasing the way it should. The problem was a bolt or a nut that was backing off, and for about a 25-cent fix, he was able to fix this problem, which the Army had spent millions of dollars trying to figure out.
And not only that, Bill, but Walt told me once that they actually almost canceled that missile project because they couldn't find it. You know, we're spending money. None of these brilliant engineers that we've hired can figure it out. They almost shut down the missile project. And so Walt, in a couple of weeks, I think is what it says in the book, God just gave him the wisdom, and because he was brilliant, he was able to quickly solve this problem. It was really amazing to me, and when he was telling me about the story himself.
Because of that, the Army awarded Walt with an early promotion to major. From there, Walt decided that he wanted to get a doctorate. That was a very unusual thing for something to happen for an Army officer to do. Typically, the Army, when they needed PhD level work, they would hire a civilian PhD. But Walt talked to his superiors and was able to secure a National Science Foundation fellowship. When he took the test for that fellowship, he scored in the 99.9th percentile. The fellowship would pay for the degree, which made it a lot more attractive for the Army to want to cut him loose for a couple of years to be able to do his doctorate. So he had the choice of either Caltech or Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He chose MIT, and he finished his degree, which is in mechanical engineering, in about 2.25 years. And he specialized in heat transfer across a plate. And Kevin has some experience with that research.
Yeah, and actually, I'd like to add to that, Bill, that Walt, and it says this in the book, that the Army never had any of their officers sent to get a doctorate until Walt. And then that one officer, the first one to ever be sent to go get a doctorate, goes and gets it at MIT. And when I was in the nuclear Navy, we were trained on, core design, reactor core design, and why it was so important for certain safety features to be adhered to. Operational procedures and automatic safety features were so important because just the slightest, delay or misoperation would cause a fuel element failure. It would burn the core. And what Walt's doctorate thesis is to transfer as much heat as possible across a thin plate into a water channel. When I was trained at nuclear power school, we were watching what was Walt's video of what he was learning about, all the different things about nucleate boiling, departure from nucleate boiling, critical heat flux, peak centerline temperature. All those things were part of his doctorate, which we're going to have posted at hptuniversity.com is going to have a posting of his doctorate thesis. And I want to emphasize this because there's naysayers out there, even within other Christian creation ministries, that think that Walt doesn't know anything about heat transfer, that he doesn't, his knowledge of heat transfer, fluid flow, all the subfields of engineering are over the top compared to other people. He was a genius. And when you have these people that sit there and question the work that he put into making sure that he was accurately communicating what happened during the flood based on all these things we're going to be teaching in the ensuing weeks, it is to me crazy. He affected reactor core designs of the military and civilians, I'm sure, too.
Well, after MIT, Walt was sent to Vietnam, and he was, right off the bat, assigned the task of trying to resolve the issue of why the newly fielded M16 rifle was jamming. Obviously, that's a problem because there were many of our soldiers that were killed because their weapon was jamming up. And Walt went to work on it, and he found, in his estimation, it was a good weapon, a good design, but there was a cleaning process that was not being properly employed. And so he ordered all the materials that required to be able to do that, the training for the soldiers, the people training the soldiers to be able to properly clean this weapon. And the results were that the jamming issue, reports of that dramatically dropped off. There was another problem that was faced by our soldiers, and that was Vietnamese soldiers tunneling in underneath the fence lines of their forward positions and being able to come in and kill our guys. So being able to detect these tunnels was extremely important. And here you can start to see Walt's brilliance in addressing a problem in the simplest manner. What he did was, because of his work with the M16 cleaning, he had a large supply of cleaning rods. Rifle cleaning rods are about 18 inches long, threaded on both ends so that you can join them together. He came up with a plan to be able to use these cleaning rods joined together, and he had his machinists create sharp points for these things. And because of the soil conditions, the soldiers were able to join these cleaning rods together and shove them down into the ground to be able to detect if there was a tunnel. If they're pushing down on these cleaning rods and all of a sudden it goes slack, they know they've reached a tunnel. And another problem was landmines. So in order to protect our soldiers against landmines, Walt developed a device that could be stuck on the front of a tank recovery vehicle and driven forward, and it would actually detonate the mines safely in a position where no one would get hurt. The parts that would be damaged were designed to be easily replaced in the field and continue on with the mission of clearing the mines.
And thinking about that, here we saw all the footage from Iraq and Afghanistan about IEDs and stuff, and some of our tanks and other things were using the very thing that Walt pioneered in designing. Here decades later, those things were being utilized and had to be further developed. Again, he set the standard for protecting troops.
Right. He also saw a need in the outlying villages in Vietnam. The villagers, people who lived in these villages, had no medical care. So he organized groups of medical doctors and nurses who in their off times or times of low activity would be able to go out into these villages and provide medical care, meet the medical needs of these local villagers. So you can see this desire that Walt has to find the simplest solution, and based on a very reliable source, as he started developing the hydroplate theory, and that reliable source is the Word of God, the Bible, which he developed to explain two problems that he had with understanding the flood: where the water came from and where did it go afterwards. And the simplicity of it is he has only one major assumption with the hydroplate theory, and that's on the pre-flood Earth with a global continent, not Pangea. More than half of the water in today's oceans was contained under the global granite crust. Gravity, physics, including nuclear physics, thermodynamics, along with other engineering fields of physics and chemistry, took over from there. We'll have more on how Dr. Brown came up with this major assumption next week. After Vietnam, Walt was sent back to the Army's Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. That is like a graduate-level school, PhD level work for senior military officers to prepare them for future assignments. From there, Walt was assigned to be the director of the Benet Research and Development Laboratories in Pennsylvania. And there he oversaw the work of 450 civilian scientists and engineers working there. And I asked him one day, what did you guys do there? And he told me, we worked with anything that came out of the barrel of a gun. So anything from small caliber pistols all the way up to large caliber artillery, Walt worked with all of them, developing new weapon systems, maintaining the old ones, and getting better performance out of the existing ones.
And Bill, one thing he told me too is they were almost all doctorates. So again, the people that questioned Walt and his ability to come up with the hydroplate theory in a way that is accurate, he was over 400 plus engineers, most of which were doctorates. And they wanted him to do it because of what he was gifted by God to be able to do. And, the military doesn't put people that are inept at the fields of engineering in charge of dozens and dozens of doctorates doing work for the military.
While Walt was at the Benet Research and Development Laboratories, he developed a desire to teach, which is something he hadn't really been able to do. So he called a friend of his who was at the Air Force Academy and to see if there was any openings there for him to be a professor. So the next day he received a call from the director of the math department at the United States Air Force Academy, and he was hired on the spot without having to go through the interview process. He was hired based on his reputation and his experience. I'd like to divert here a little bit. At the time, Walt was a theistic evolutionist, which means that it's the idea that God created all things using a process of evolution. That belief was about to radically change, and he, within a few months, became a young Earth creationist. And that happened after he accepted his assignment to the Air Force Academy in 1970, he was driving across Kansas on his way heading west towards the Air Force Academy. And he's listening to a radio show to try to stay awake. And on the radio show, they were discussing reported sightings of Noah's Ark. And these sightings came from people that lived at various times. They didn't have the opportunity. They didn't know each other. They didn't have the opportunity to talk. It was for the internet and made them for mass communications. What got Walt's attention was that these witnesses, even though they didn't know each other, were saying the same thing about what they saw, the Ark, in the mountains of Ararat. So when you have witnesses saying the same thing and they don't have the opportunity to communicate, that increases your confidence in increase your level of confidence in their testimony, in this case about the Ark. I was trained as an aircraft accident investigator in the Air Force, and that's one of the things I was trained to do is look for witnesses, but make sure they don't talk, because otherwise they'll start feeding stories into each other's head, and what they didn't see becomes the reality that they think they saw. So you have all these witnesses across many different times and geographic areas who were in that area at one time or another saying the same thing. So that's a good indication that it's actually there from the eyewitness testimony point of view. So while driving towards the Front Range of the Colorado Rocky Mountains where the Air Force Academy is, Walt starts asking some questions because the Rampart Mountain Range that he's looking at is roughly the same altitude as the mountains of Ararat where the Bible says that the Ark rested. So he asked himself, how could an object big enough to fill a football stadium, the Ark, end up on the landing on mountains of that size? Where did all the water come from? And where did all the water go afterwards? And today, all of our listeners can ask the same question. For example, why sea creature fossils are found on every major mountain range in the world. Only the hydroplate theory has an explanation that is scientifically sound and supported by the evidence. So at the Academy, Walt started developing the hydroplate theory as a way to answer these questions. After he was at an instructor at the Air Force Academy for a year, he was offered the position of a tenured professor. But a conditional upon that acceptance, he needed to cross over his commission into the Air Force. So at that point, Walt switched from the green uniform of the Army to the blue uniform of the Air Force, and he ended up becoming the head of the mathematics department. And it was during this time at the Academy that Walt seriously began to study the flood and searching for a way to explain what he began to see as the most significant geological event in the history of planet Earth. And he started with the Bible. This led him to start looking at what produced the great fountains of the deep that he read about in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11.
And thinking about that, first of all, the Air Force recognized him so much that they took him from the Army and took him into the Air Force to teach the elite of the elite for the Air Force and the Air Force Academy. And now he's humbling himself to just sit there and say, I want to know what the Bible says. I have this dilemma. And the two key verses that all hydroplate theory advocates really emphasize, because it is so clear in scriptures, that, as Bill just talked about, that there was water underneath the crust, and that water ruptured out, just like also the animation that Walt Brown was narrating here a while ago. And I want to read these two verses. Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And Walt reading that, just starting with that, it implies if you're going to have a fountain of water that then sprays all over the world to create global rainfall, not the normal hydrological cycle where we get our rain, he just saw the Bible's telling me there's water underneath the crust. And somehow the crust ruptured, and it ruptured up into, and actually God opened the heavens. We're going to find out that the evidence supports that jettison of debris from those fountains went up into space. And God opened the windows. That's what the Bible says, a very reliable source. And then 2 Peter 3:3, the Apostle Peter in the New Testament, knowing this verse, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? We're living those days. I mean, that's what people are saying. You know, they're whole sold out into evolution and billions of years. And that you Christians are talking about Jesus coming back. We've been hearing that a long time. For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. The uniformitarian dogma that's taught in the schools. The Bible predicts the last days will have this, the uniformitarian view that is crammed down the throats of the inhabitants of the earth. For this, these people that push that narrative, they willfully forget that by the word of God, the heavens were of old and the earth standing out of the water. So the pre-flood earth had dry areas of the global continent, but there were also pre-flood seas, the lower parts. But then it says something really incredible. The earth standing out of water and in the water. So the Bible, Peter was inspired by God to say that the earth that we stand on was standing in water because the crust was touching down on the mantle through an ocean of water. They standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed, perished, being flooded with water. So it was the water that it was standing in, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So the Bible is perfectly clear. There was an ocean of water underneath the crust that ruptured out, and that's where the water came from. Where it went, we'll talk about later on in future podcasts, including next week. Well, and you saw it in the teaching of Walt Brown in the animation that was shown.
Well, Walt began teaching others about creation and the flood during his off-duty time while he was at the Air Force Academy, and started getting small seminars, and he started producing notes for people attending these seminars, provided it to them in published form. And that became the genesis of his book, which is now in its 9th edition, In the Beginning, Compelling Evidence for Creation and the Flood. Well, after 4 years at the Air Force Academy, the Air Force sent Walt down to the Air War College. The Air Force has 2 professional military courses, one for junior officers, one for senior officers. Air Command and Staff College is for junior officers. That's one that I had to complete when I was on active duty as well. And the senior officers, which I did not attend, is the Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base. Walt finished as a distinguished graduate from the Air War College. He then returned to the Air Force Academy for another year, and he became head of the Operations Research Department. And 1 year later, the Air War College invited Walt back. Well, that was in 1976. That's the year that I showed up at the Air Force Academy to start as a cadet. I did not know Walt personally there. I really didn't hear about him for about another 15 years when I came into possession of his 5th edition of his book, In the Beginning. So Walt went to the Air War College in 1976, and he stayed there for 4 years, and there he became in charge of the curriculum for science, technology, and decision-making curriculum. In 1980, however, Walt was offered by the Air Force to be the head of the geophysics laboratory, which is located near Boston. At that time, Walt had become very involved in developing the hydroplate theory, and he and his wife Peggy decided that it would be a good time for him to retire so that he could pursue this ministry. So after 21 years, Walt retired as a full colonel from the Air Force to pursue his work on the hydroplate theory. The next thing that he did after that was he became the head of ICR Midwest, Institute of Creation Research, had a division out in the Midwestern Chicago area, and Walt became the head of that. And during that time, he gave creation seminars, which included speaking about the flood and his work on developing the hydroplate theory. Of course, at the time, there was the predominant view of the flood model being presented by the large creation organizations was the canopy theory. And Walt would speak on the hydroplate theory, which was a competing theory. He would only address the canopy theory when asked by audience members during the question and answer period. And when asked, he would state the problems that were known about the canopy theory. Differences of opinion, however, with the canopy theory caused some conflicts between Walt and the leadership of ICR, which ended up with Walt separating from his Institute of Creation Research. But although that was an unfortunate situation at the time, Walt's trying to figure out what he's going to do. What that did was it allowed him to have much more time to pursue his work on the hydroplate theory. But he also recognized that he needed to beef up his knowledge of geology. So he moved his family to Arizona where he could be closer to his parents and decided to enroll in Arizona State University so that he could study under the tutelage of Dr. Robert Dietz, who's one of the founders, one of the authors of plate tectonics. Now, before Walt started there, in 1985, he had already gotten a chance to meet and interact with Dr. Dietz at ASU back in 1981, where Walt, after a speaking tour, had given a certain amount of time for Dr. Dietz to be able to provide a rebuttal. And at the end of that, both of them agreed to have a written debate. The topic of the debate was, does the scientific evidence favor creation or evolution? One of the restrictions of that debate was that no religious topics could be discussed, something which Walt was fully prepared to do. A few months later, Dr. Dietz decided to back out quietly from this debate because he realized that from his side, he could not debate this issue without attacking religion. So back 4 years later, Walt is at ASU because he wanted to study geology from the evolutionist perspective, and he believed that that would help him be able to make a much better case for creation and the flood and sharpen his skills in geology for developing his hydroplate theory. Now, Dr. Dietz, when Walt showed up in 1985 to start taking classes from him, Dr. Dietz knew who Walt was in developing a theory that would be competing with his plate tectonics theory. Yet despite that professional competition, they developed a friendship. And that friendship included Dr. Dietz offering to meet with Walt every Wednesday afternoon for a year. They spent well over 100 hours together discussing various aspects of their theory. And then, after a couple hours of discussion on Wednesday, they would then together walk down to the Wednesday afternoon geology forum there at ASU to listen to the guest speakers. And quite often, Walt was invited to dinner with Dr. Dietz with some of those guest speakers. And come to find out that Dr. Dietz and Walt would sit the front row in the center as they would listen to these speakers. But the other geology professors who knew who Walt was, that he was a creationist developing a competing theory, would sit several rows back, not wanting to be close to Walt, I guess. And one of the things that came out of that relationship was a joint research project in 1986 where Dr. Dietz and Dr. Brown, discussing various evidences of theory, decided to make predictions, which is one of the valuable things in science, is being able to have enough confidence in your theory to make predictions. So they chose, as they were studying and discussing the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, they decided to do a research project to figure out what the cross-section of the fracture zones which cross the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, what do they look like? What's their profile? Dr. Brown predicted that there would be tension cracks. The deep ones would be U-shaped, the shallow ones would be V-shaped, and Dr. Dietz predicted that there would be shearing surfaces rubbing up against each other as a result of compression. So tension versus compression. Now, neither of them apparently knew that research on those fracture zones had already been accomplished several years before. They were able to find this published research. In the published research, the field data supported Dr. Brown's view that those are tension cracks in the configuration that he predicted. But in addition, they also found that in those tension cracks were undisturbed sediments, something which would not happen if those were shearing surfaces that Dr. Dietz, using the plate tectonics theory, predicted. So for people that think that Dr. Brown has nothing meaningful to say about geology because he's not a professional geologist or an outsider, really need to take a hard look at this relationship between Dr. Dietz and Dr. Brown. I would ask the question of some of these geologists, did you get a chance to study under Robert Dietz? Did he offer to meet once a week for several hours for well over a year to discuss various aspects of your theory? Did you enter into a joint research project with Dr. Dietz where your theory came out on top as far as the predictions? Walt is very well qualified, not only to speak about geology, but the ability to think across many different disciplines of science and tie it together into a very cohesive, understandable cause and effect relationship, which is consistent with scientific principles and laws. So as I wrap this portion of it up, if you're a Christian, been a Christian for a while, this may be the first time that you're hearing about the hydroplate theory. And so there is a backstory to why that information hasn't got out. To me, it is the backstory behind that is it's been going on for about 35 years. It's one of the ugliest stains on American Christian church. But Kevin has a lot more diplomatic approach, so I'm going to let him explain that situation.
And people have to understand, Dr. Dietz, once a year, one geologist is given the Penrose Prize for the year for their accomplishment as a geologist. Dr. Dietz is one of the recipients of a Penrose Prize. And so he is cream of the crop geologist, had great respect for Walt because of his integrity, his love for people, his humility, and he was totally open with Walt. At times even showed him 3 places on the mid-oceanic ridge that basically proved plate tectonics that he was teaching. And he was the one that he's credited with the term seafloor spreading, which is that the mid-oceanic ridge is building up from a liquid core, is working its way to the surface, bringing it up to the top, and then spreading out, seafloor spreading at the mid-oceanic ridge. And he provided Walt with what he knew were real problems with that are documented in the trench chapter, and Walt references that to Dr. Dietz giving him the information. When he would admit that plate tectonics had real failure mechanisms within it, he goes, so are you going to tell somebody, are you going to tell everybody else besides me? And he goes, nope, not going to say a thing. Why? Because if Dietz abandons seafloor spreading, then he is sacrificing his pride. He would instantly be vilified. And that's really what goes into, as Bill said, the greatest misjustice within Christian creation ministries that was perpetrated against Dr. Brown over the last 30-some years. As you said, Bill, it started with Walt, instead of teaching a man-made canopy theory that wasn't scientific, and except for one verse in the Bible that you twist to make it say that the waters came from the heaven to flood the earth, can't even possibly scientifically happen without a miracle. And even if God worked a miracle to flood the earth by bringing a canopy theory on the existing earth topography, the question then begs, where did the water go? And nobody, and I remember those early days as a Christian being taught that flood theory, and it's kind of like everybody checked their brain, like, that can't be true, because where did the water go? You need another miracle of God showing up with a big shop vac and taking trillions upon trillions of gallons off of the earth. And it wasn't scientific, it wasn't biblical, but that was the dogma. Just like COVID. You're going to teach this dogma, and if you don't teach it, you're persona non grata. And Walt wanted to stick with science. He wanted to stick with the Bible. He knew that his theory that he was developing was consistent with the Bible. And he would tell me more than once, and he told you too, Bill, because you've told me the same thing. I could be wrong, Kevin. I could be wrong. We have to see the evidence. We have to continue to accumulate evidence and determine if it is consistent with the theory of the waters, the fountains of the great deep being broken up, as I propose in this theory. Well, I can tell you from the first time he ever told me that, and over the years since then, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. But here's the issue with it. People have to understand, if you heard from the major creation organizations, CMI, Christian Ministries International in Australia, Creation Research Society Quarterly, that put out a quarterly newsletter, they vilify Dr. Brown, consider him a deceiver. Answers in Genesis, which won't allow Mike Snavely's video that you watch at the beginning of this, they currently, and I'm hoping all these people will come around someday and they'll see the errors in their ways, but they won't let anybody that advocates for the hydroplate theory have any public information. They will not share, spread, otherwise anything other than censoring Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory. And the last one, ICR, Institute for Creation Research, they haven't yet, but they're coming close. We've got to call in hoping that they're going to carry the 9th edition, because Randy Galusa, the current CEO, and I talked at length when we were on a hydroplate theory advocating tour of the Grand Canyon and the surrounding national parks, that all attest to Walt Brown's theory on how the Grand Canyon was formed. He and I agreed that what should be the case, especially for Christians, is that whatever's the truth, I can honestly be thinking, as the catastrophic plate tectonic theory people advocate, I could can sincerely think, I think this is what happened. But then you find out the evidence is completely contrary, and you have to keep on advocating for miracles to prop up your theory because it doesn't work scientifically or biblically. And if somebody comes around with something that, they don't need miracles, except for the creation of water under the crust and then it rupturing, they don't. So that's a competing theory. And so I have to sacrifice my pride. You see, that's what Bob Dietz wouldn't do. He wouldn't sacrifice his pride. And so he had to go through life continuing to teach people seafloor spreading when he knew it wasn't true. And he died that way because he's now passed away. Walt didn't have an empire to take care of. He didn't have to pay payrolls for all these scientists that are trying to work on a broken theory. He didn't have to pay for all the staff that are running around the country selling books and bringing in money into the franchise. He didn't have to do a bunch of mailing and getting mailing lists to get all those donation dollars. He sat in his office and he worked and read over many lifetimes worth of scientific journals, documenting them all, putting them into the hundreds of references in his 9th edition book. of secular science articles where these people are admitting, these scientists are admitting, we're finding this is contrary to what we think. This is this and this. And Walt's putting them in there saying the hydroplate theory doesn't have any problem with any of these scientific discoveries. But the secular evolutionary billions of years paradigm, they have problems. And so if the truth is that what I believe, even sincerely, is not true, it's proven to be not supported by the facts, I should be willing, as a Christian creationist ministry, to at least not censor somebody that does have the truth. I mean, that does have evidence that supports their theory. And actually what I would do, just my conviction of going from being a total pagan when I was raised in my evolutionary dogma, and then becoming a Christian, and then becoming a Christian pastor, and knowing what Jesus teaches in the Bible, if I knew I put out a book sincerely written at the time that ended up being false, even about doctrines of the church or anything, and I found out, whoa, I was wrong, I would want to pull that book away from the publisher and burn all the copies so I don't deceive people. That is not how human nature works. Unfortunately, it should work that way, but it doesn't, because there's all the ramifications: loss of your job, loss of your prestige, loss of everything you've worked your whole life for. And so, as a result of Walt being on this other theory, when the narrative is taking, the catastrophic plate crowd, instead of starting with the Bible and looking for the evidence, they started with evolution. They started with seafloor spreading. They started with what Bob Dietz didn't even agree in his own understanding was true. And then they say, well, a miracle happened and it all sped up. And so they came up with catastrophic plate tectonics. So Walt is a threat to them. And so I'm just encouraging you, as we go through this with the hydroplate theory, Walt might be wrong on this or that. We're going to be talking about things. There might be weaknesses in the theory, but the Bible says the fountains of the great deep burst up and the windows of heaven were open. You're going to find compelling, overwhelming evidence of the fact that that's what happened. It's not evolutionary seafloor spreading put on steroids. We're hoping in the future, in our future broadcasts, that you'll be compelled, like Walt's title says, compelling evidence for science, for the creation science and the flood. It is compelling. And Bill and I will be talking about that in our next podcast, more about our backgrounds, how we got to this. And we want to just thank you for joining us for this first podcast of HPT University. And the next posting will provide more of our backgrounds. Please check our website at hptuniversity.com and join our Facebook page, Hydroplate Theory. And the QR codes are posted on the screen for that, which will help you keep posted about upcoming events. So once again, don't listen to the naysayers. When you ask Ford, what do you think about Chevy? They're not too impressed with Chevy engineering. And the same way the other way. Go ask, study what happens when Harley Davidson came out with their engine and Indian motorcycles were fighting them. Read about Thomas Edison and Tesla and how they fought because they had competing theories. And we should stick with theories that are biblical and scientific. And I hope you'll join us in the future podcasts, as you'll be astounded at the evidence. And you will look at the world that we walk on in totally different ways. When you go through cut out interstate highways and you see folded mountain sedimentary layers and tilted layers, and you wonder, how could that happen? You're going to know. You can't explain it by seafloor spreading, catastrophic plate tectonics or billions of years, but you can perfectly understand it with the hydroplate theory that we'll be talking about. Thank you for joining us for this first podcast, and God bless you. We hope we see you for the next one.
Thank you for viewing this episode of Hydroplate Theory University. We hope you'll return for future episodes. Please like and subscribe, spread the word, and be sure to visit creationscience.com, where you can find more great hydroplate resources.